According to the University of Vermont, a mature sugar maple can produce as many as 200,000 leaves in a single season. The town of Mount Enos was set in a sea of these trees which stretched for miles across the hills, rolling high up onto the mountain from which the town took its name. Memories of my childhood in that small town feel different from the rest of my life. Enchanted, beguiling, whatever the word might be. The forest was a constant, nearly magical presence in our lives, imposing itself on every horizon. People would tell stories of nymphs who planted the unfathomably massive orchard, stories of beasts which clung to tall trunks with vicious claws, waiting to drop on any of those who wandered too close. I never believed the stories, though I understood why people told them. Something so majestic as the forests of Mount Enos seemed to demand reverence. I used to believe that God reveals himself to us in grand displays of natural beauty. Watching the billions of tiny, verdant sprites dancing in the late summer winds as the sun set far beyond, and the dazzling blizzards of fiery reds and vibrant yellows mixed throughout with shades of somber orange under autumn's dying sun. These moments felt to me like looking upon his face. Nowadays, I live in Arizona. We could all see the signs of what would later be hailed as a miracle as early as March that year. At first, nobody could quite put their finger on what had changed about the tree line. No large swath had fallen, and no new copse had grown. To the untrained eye, the difference was both unmistakable and indiscernible. John Ratley, proud proprietor of the Mount Enos nursery, was the closest thing we had seen to an arborist in the town of 500. He was sent out to examine the trees, and when he returned, his eyes were bright like those of a child. "It's magnificent!" All ran like ribbon laced through his every syllable. "You see, the trees are in their budding season. Each bud represents a new branch, a new growth. Now ordinarily we'd be seeing somewhere in the range of 50 to 200 new buds per tree per season." He seemed to suddenly realize that he outpaced his breath, drawing in a large puff of air before continuing to speak. "This year each tree is plastered with these suckers. I'd estimate upwards of 14,000 new buds per tree." Old Mr. Ratley looked around the room, hoping to see that the gleam in his eye had become infectious. But nobody cared anymore. The mystery had been solved. The fun was over. Mr. Ratley offered up a meek, "It'll be a green summer," as we all filed out of the town hall and back into the humdrum of our daily lives. He was right. It was impossible not to notice how much more alive the forest had been that summer. The new branches crossed each other in wild intersections, each fighting for every inch of available space. By the end of August, the trees had grown thicker and heavier than ever before. The overabundance had been a great source of beauty. I'd never seen such a decadent array of vibrant, verdant shades before or since. The winds of summer shattered into tiny fragments against the foliage, which had grown so thick that the leaves behaved as if they were a singular, solid object. Strong gusts were transmuted into gentle breezes as they wove their way through the near infinite green gauntlet, causing the leaves of the trees to vibrate gently with the pathetic force which remained. I spent a lot of time that summer staring out at the tree line and asking questions to the empty air. Questions of who I am, why I'm here. The kind of questions that come to mind when you're looking God in the eye. I never received any reply. The weight of the excessive growth forced the trees to sink deeper into the earth. their roots stretching up and out as if clinging to the edge of some infinite chasm, as if afraid they might fall. The word weighed heavier on all of us as the season drew near. At the time, we thought it would be a little more than an inconvenience. We had no idea what was in store. First, there came a pale, sickly yellow. Then a rich, crimson red began to leer out from deep within the green tree line. By mid-September, the color had largely bled away, leaving behind desiccated remnants of what once was. Deep, modest, earthy browns and oranges like rust grew dominant in the forest. The leaves had dried, but the weakened westerly winds had not the strength to shake them loose of their perch. It was mid-October before the first of them lazily listed down to the earth below, falling at the feet of its mother. The wind, affronted by the stubbornness of the foliage, summoned up all the strength it had ever known. A vicious, persistent gale from all directions ripped its way through the autumnal labyrinths of branch and leaf. The winds whooped and wailed together as they brought ruin down upon the forest, and there, caught in the middle, was the town of Mount Enos. From all sides, titanic walls of dying plant matter rose high enough to block out the sun. In my memory, the rays of the sun cast each individual leaf in stark relief as it oozed through the space between them. It would have been awe-inspiring, though frightening, but we were not allowed even enough time to react. A moment after we saw their rise, they were upon us. There was a rustling sound, like the jittering wings of a trillion locusts. Then a jolt shook the foundations of my home, hoists and beams flexing horribly as the collective weight draped itself across the house. The walls bowed visibly inward, and I heard the shatter of glass as the tidal wave of autumn's newfound fury pressed in from all sides. A horrible realization struck me. My wife had been outside. The dahlias outside our bedroom window needed to be dug up for the winter. The tubers will freeze and die otherwise. I found her there, in the window. Her body had been hopelessly and brutally squeezed against the vinyl siding of our home, the one she had begged and pleaded for despite it being outside our budget. Through the window pane, a deluge of leaves spread itself across the space where her neck used to be. A torrent had driven her throat against the shattered glass of the window. Brutal, horrible crimson splashed itself across the growing pile of decaying plant matter. I felt my soul shatter into a million miserable pieces as I lifted her severed head, bringing her forehead to rest against my own. I held my eyes closed as tightly as I possibly could. I screamed and sobbed and raged loud enough to shame the winds outside, which now whistled terrible reverie through the bare, interwoven branches of the forest. I wanted to drown out all else beyond the feel of her rapidly cooling skin against mine, begging the warmth that was left there to hold out for even a minute more. As you can imagine, finding my wife like that made a terrible introduction to the isolation of being trapped beneath the ever-growing banks of crisp golden leaves. The colors themselves had become completely imperceptible, as the leaves above blocked more and more sunlight. It wasn't long before I was left in abject darkness. I had no way to appreciate the true scale of it at the time. I knew my house was definitely buried completely, but I had no idea that the pile stretched another 20 feet beyond the second-story roof. I stayed in darkness for what was either 6 weeks or 6 days. The inky blackness of my grief wrapped itself around me, causing me to feel as if I were among my own kind, as I stood there in the void which used to be so full of love and light. Food wasn't an issue, as I hadn't been eating much at all. I'd fumble for a can of beans in the dark, bash it against the linoleum floor until it burst, and then blindly slurp the contents. One night as I fumbled through the pantry, I felt my hand lay upon something waxy and smooth. A candle. It felt like I hadn't seen light in 1,000 years, and the idea of it kind of scared me. Despite this strange trepidation, I didn't hesitate to search desperately for hours to find a box of matches. When I finally got it lit, I sat beside the candle as if it were a campfire. I fell asleep there. When I woke up, my breathing had become difficult. I could feel by the way that my lungs burned that oxygen had become scarce. The candle's fire had eaten too greedily of the air while I slept, leaving next to nothing for my respiratory system. I was desperate, the cilia in my lungs clawing and clamoring for every available iota of breathable air. The decision I made was one rooted in panic, but I don't regret it. I threw open the front door and laid the faintly burning candle at the precipice. The fire spread with a vengeance, as if offended by the sheer amount of unburned flammable material. I slammed the door in horrified realization as the fruits of my panic spread viciously across the massive pile. The sound of it was completely indescribable. Each leaf brought fire to dozens more, all crinkling and folding in upon themselves, sending embers far off to spark new colonies of flame. The air began to circulate as heat moved throughout the pile, bringing a rush of oxygen as the leaves which held my wife against my home burst into flame. I had no choice but to let it burn. The pictures, the memories, the bed we shared, her severed head. I had to let it all go, or face annihilation. I slammed the door closed and jammed a wet towel against the crack under the door, begging for her forgiveness as I sobbed in fear. In the end, for whatever reason, my home was one of the few spared. The fire had torn through the town of Mount Enos, killing 300 people in all. The cleanup was slow and gruesome. Many had been making their commute when the leaf storm fell over our town. Mr. Ratley, the pseudo-botanist from before, was found with his head trapped in the jamb of his car door. The coroner thinks he was trying to climb out when the weight shifted and pinned him. Many others were found trapped in their cars, dead of apparent asphyxiation. As I assisted those of us who were left in pulling body after body from the derelict vehicles, unbuckling safety belts and car seat straps alike and looking into countless, lifeless eyes, I could only think one thing. I don't regret starting that fire.